I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm going to read a paper. This paper is attached to basically the video. I'm going to hyperlink the link to the article for you to read along. Basically, this paper is just going to be me reading this article that I wrote, and by all means, feel free to watch and feel free to read along. The title of the article is Strategic Approaches to Mediation, Negotiation, Arbitration, and Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and this is here for you. So, let's begin. Abstract. Unlike the evolutionary process, where biological transformation unfolds gradually throughout time, social transformation, even dramatic social change, frequently occurs within the span of an individual lifetime. While the conditions for biological change readily lend themselves to technological manipulation, the same is not true for social transformation. Though contemporary scientists possess the knowledge needed to manipulate our genetic code and thereby arguably manipulate the very nature of the evolutionary process, social manipulation and mobilization will certainly prove to be an even more difficult task than biological and genetic manipulation. The possibility for social change, then, requires a unique understanding of the flexibility of social constructed phenomena, which varies between cultures, religions, and ethnicities. The attempt to transform the social, then, is invariably linked to specific individuals within society, deeply wedded and cognizant of the socio-cultural affects that inform social behavior. Within any society where social change occurs, macro-level behavioral transformation must occur. Thus, the mark of social change is inherently associated with strategically identified by the emerging trends in social behavior. Interestingly enough, and essentially by definition, trends exist because of manipulation. The trend, or a trend, is a consequence of manipulation. Thus, since trends are inherently constructed, and since they are associated with macro-level socio-behavioral change, and since macro-level socio-behavioral change serves as empirical identifiers for social transformation, emerging social trends indicate the potential occurrence of otherwise latent social change. Okay, effectively using mediation strategies for social change, the role of mediator impartiality. Of all the possible mediation strategies potential mediators could incorporate in effectively practicing mediation, mediator impartiality buttresses the entire process of mediation. More specifically, in terms of the mediator's role within social change, authentic social change will invariably demand mediator impartiality. The mediator's impartiality creates the possibility for disclosure, which is essential in any conflict resolution model. The overwhelming difficulty in understanding social change, or even more audacious prospect of facilitating social transformation, rests in divergent opinions about how that transformational process should occur. It is precisely for this reason, that is, since opinions of social transformation will differ throughout any given population, that mediator impartiality becomes critical in the process of social change. Practical applications for the effective use of mediator impartiality emphasizes a shared space wherein disclosure is facilitated. There are several methods that mediators can incorporate into their practice to demonstrate their impartiality and thereby encourage greater disclosure. Quite obviously, at the beginning of any new mediation, mediators should inform each party that they assume an objective and impartial stance, which potentially fosters conflict resolution. The process of social change is undeniably a tumultuous and frequently conflictual process, wherein fundamental transformations manifest in behavioral change. And that's important, right? The idea is that because of mediator impartiality, if we want to talk about social transformation, you can't really talk about social transformation, I argue, without also identifying and talking specifically about behavioral transformation. Social transformation means behavioral transformation. The The anticipation of these required behavioral changes serves as a source for much of the social conflict that surfaces as the process of social transformation unfolds. For example, it is almost certain that within the first half of the 21st century, LGBTI couples will finally attain many of the rights that they have been otherwise denied, a social transformation that will change the behavior of countless millions within Western cultures. The behavioral transformation, namely the ability for LGBTI couples to wed or to serve openly in the armed services, creates a condition of anxiety within the population not immediately benefited by these emerging social changes. Again, social transformation on a macro level is facilitated by behavioral transformation on a micro level, coupled with policy and such. Thus, as part of an effective process of mediation, it is of great importance that potential mediators practice impartiality. Than profess impartiality. It's better to do it than to talk about doing it. Note, however, that even the practice of impartiality serves as grounds for conflict. Returning to the example, impartiality would be compromised in mediating emerging social conflicts between, for example, LGBTI communities and those who do not support the LGBTI movement if the mediator were a member of the LGBTI community. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that the appearance for mediator impartiality is thus, in some sense, subjectively embodied. That's your subjective embodiment, right? And thereby, the positions that you take, the perception of your body, the community affiliation that you profess to have or that you're known to have, can unfortunately compromise impartiality. This creates an exceedingly difficult but understandable conflict in facilitating social change. The assumption is membership in certain communities compromise impartiality, a claim which is seemingly easy to dismiss. There is, however, tremendous legitimacy to this stance. Rhetorically speaking, then, one is certainly justified in asking, does membership or identification with certain social movements compromise mediator impartiality? I'm here disinterested in the answer. The objective is to identify the role and practical applications of mediator impartiality within the process of social transformation, which raises the question of one's ability to remain impartial in light of potential advantages gained from such transformation. Obviously, if I am a mediator and I am mediating a conflict which has potential social implications, obviously this is not interpersonal mediation, this is more of a macro level social implication mediation model, then the argument might be, if I, as a member of the LGBTI community, could gain from the social transformation, can I be perceived as being impartial in the process of mediation? It's a very technical, very difficult question to address, but that's the point of this paper, at least the first point. Though many will disagree with the notion that identification with or membership in social groupings compromises impartiality, there's a rather ingenious practical solution to this apparent dilemma, namely the systematic and strategic attempt to co-opt moderates within the population, those who will not directly benefit from such social transformations as a means of establishing impartiality. Though, for example, membership in the LGBTI community may arguably compromise mediator impartiality, the same assumption does not hold if the mediator is identified as heterosexual. The conceptual justification for this point are beyond the scope of this analysis. In the civil rights protests of the previous century, however, social activists systematically and strategically targeted the quote-unquote white moderates, since they too would not directly benefit from the process of social transformation. Again, right, mediator impartiality with respect to social transformation is facilitated arguably by the sort of impartial embodiment, or more technically speaking, by the lack of directly benefiting from social transformation. Thus, whites in the civil rights era who had an affinity to the civil rights movement weren't inherently going to benefit from social transformation directly. They weren't directly the focus of social transformation. Similarly, heterosexuals who are sympathetic to the LGBTI movement aren't directly going to benefit from any social transformation that recognizes LGBTI rights. However, if members from the LGBTI community attempt to mediate social conflict as we get closer to that point where rights are recognized, it's going to be difficult to hold a stance of mediator impartiality if I am a mediator in the conflict, or to the conflict, and I'm also a member of the LGBTI community, because I gain, arguably, from the social transformation dynamics as a result of this process. The argument then becomes, well, get sympathetic individuals from the community who aren't directly going to benefit from social transformation and have them mediate the conflict. It's a very simple workaround for those of you that understand where I'm going with this. And I admit this paper's a bit advanced. Mediator impartiality, despite its overwhelming... Oh, well, sorry, one more part. Thus, the appearance, quote-unquote, which is emphasis, right? The appearance of impartiality is as significant as being impartial. Mediator impartiality, despite its overwhelming use throughout conflict resolution literature, is categorically and epistemologically inaccessible. There is absolutely no, nor could there ever be, any even theoretical way of demonstrating impartiality. Right? Impartiality is if it exists as such, I mean, and it does. It exists. It exists cognitively, and there isn't an empirical means other than believing someone's word that they are in fact impartial. So that the argument becomes that the appearance of being impartial is as important, if not more important, than actually being impartial. Right? So, very technical piece so far. It might actually benefit you to just read it and then come back and watch the video and watch some commentary on it. But so last bit, thus mediator impartiality is facilitated by the appearance of not directly benefiting from potential social change. Okay, so effectively using mediation strategies for social transformation, the role of self-determination. So first section on mediator impartiality, second section on the role of self-determination within social transformation specifically, and the mediator's role in social transformation. Though it is now clear that mediator impartiality is facilitated by the appearance of impartiality more so than genuine impartiality, whatever genuine impartiality means, which is certainly not to exclude the possibility of genuine impartiality, it does deny the possibility of demonstrating such a stance on epistemological grounds. One can now address the role of the right of each party to exercise self-determination during the process of mediation. Mediator impartiality aside, the tenets of self-determination are rooted in the ethical recognition that sentient human beings are free to live autonomous lives, provided the act of living does not drastically interfere with the lives of others, and in specifically Kantian terms, the mediator does not use parties to the conflict as a means of facilitating some end. People are thus ends in themselves. The underlying threat, quote-unquote, to any formal or informal mediation frequently manifests in an unavoidable impasse. The attempt, then, to undermine a party's right to self-determination as a means of decreasing the rate of impasse, for example, is clearly an ethical violation. With respect to the complex nature of social change, however, it is clear that the notion of self-determination is profoundly complicated by the absolute difficulty in determining the process of social change. Remember, we're talking about, in this first section, social change, social transformation, and the mediator's role in social transformation and social change. We're not talking about the mediator's role in organizational or interpersonal conflict, specifically social transformation, social change, and the mediator's role in facilitating the emerging conflicts that will invariably arise. Again, social change is far more difficult to quote-unquote master, to influence, to manipulate than biological change. For a party to a conflict to know that exercising her right to self-determination will lead to specific social change is to assume a direct connection between self-determining agents and social transformation, which is denied by the systematic effects of structural violence, for example. There is an overwhelming complex system which, to a great extent, determines or at least influences individual choice. Since choice can be influenced, then the notion of self-determination within macro-level social change is obviously complicated by any number of factors, including structural violence. Thus, the attempt to quote-unquote exercise self-determination within an instance of profound social change requires a simultaneous recognition of all, or at least many of those factors that influence, and that's important, right? Those factors that influence a party's decision-making process. Let me pause there for a second. It's very dense. The idea is self-determination, party self-determination, is a critical concept in any mediation model at an interpersonal, organizational, or at an international level. The argument is, however, at the international level, at the macro level, it's not as simple as just wielding the concept self-determination. Because as we know, individuals' decision-making process that they freely arrive at, quote-unquote freely arrive at, is itself influenced by structural violence, structural change, socio-economic factors. So the argument then becomes, when we talk about self-determination in a mediation process at a macro level, how honest are we being in our theoretical model to evoke self-determination and the absolute insistence for self-determination at the macro level, right? To do so, I would argue, is to sort of naively discard all of the environmental, both socioeconomic, socio-cultural, socio-religious factors that factor into an individual's decision-making process. So I want to be really rigorous with that point, right? These external conditions will invariably determine population behavior. Excuse me. For example, in cases of quote-unquote urban land redevelopment, wherein local municipalities have financial incentives to revitalize urban spaces, which far too frequently results in the dislocation of urban populations in terms of gentrification, what have you. The fact that urban spaces are dilapidated and underfunded informs the decision to leave those communities in the first place, right? So your free decision to decide to leave those communities is itself influenced by the dilapidated nature of the community themselves. So that your decision to leave isn't really an act of self-determination, it's a consequence of the dilapidated community, which again demonstrates the fact that the discussion of self-determination and the insistence for self-determination at a macro level, not at a micro level, not at an interpersonal level, is far more complicated than just evoking self-determination. The obvious point then, which should be quite clear, is the decision to exercise the right to leave this particular community does not occur as a consequence of self-determination, because conditions were systematically constructed to determine that decision-making process. To again complicate the traditional stance within canonical conflict resolution literature, I would argue that the attempt to realize the right to self-determination within the process of mediation, at least at the micro level, requires mediators to actively participate in identifying, along with the parties to the conflict, all those factors that inform one's decision-making process. The actual role of the mediator at a macro level social transformation process, in that process of social transformation, requires that if we're going to talk about self-determination, we recognize that we mean by self-determination, and we obligate ourselves by self-determination, the requirement to identify those factors that influence the decision-making to the party, right? That's the only way that we can talk about it, because there are factors that influence the decision-making process of any party to a social transformation conflict, and to talk about, now it's getting really dense, but to talk about social transformation and to evoke self-determination without recognizing these influences is extremely naive. My approach, however, stands in a somewhat polemic relation to the traditional description of self-determination. Simply stated, I endorse the very active participation and deliberation influencing a highly skilled mediators, influence of highly skilled mediators in the mediation process, including the strategic attempt to elucidate those social factors that might influence one's decision-making process, which is simply justified by the fact that well-informed parties can truly exercise their right to self-determination, thus truthfully informing parties to a conflict of those factors that might influence their decision-making process is absolutely a responsibility of any mediator, specifically a mediator in a macro-level conflict wherein that conflict could potentially manifest in social transformation. Section's really dense. You might want to read that by yourself without having me sort of, narrate it, and you can make notes on your own. The overarching concept is simple. Any individual's decision-making process is influenced by many socio-cultural, socio-economic factors. In order for the party to truly exercise socially transformational decision-making, the individual needs to recognize those external factors. Next section. Effectively using mediation strategies for social change. The process is externalizing the conflict. So, foundations within narrative theory, as implemented within the field of mediation, utilize a technique of externalization in facilitating the effectiveness of the mediation process. To externalize a problem, that is, the source of contention that brought the respective parties to mediate their dispute, is to contextualize the problem without attributing the problem to other party to the conflict. For example, if within the context of mediating a financial dispute between spouses, the mediator identified that greed, quote unquote, may have been one of the conditions that led the couple to mediate their dispute, rather than allowing either party to say the other party was greedy, a skilled mediator would externalize the concept of greed and assess how did greed affect your relationship. So the mediator, rather than allowing the parties to say, Bob was greedy, or to say Mary was greedy, a skilled mediator would externalize the concept of greed and use greed as a mechanism of protecting either party from attack. So the question would be that the mediator might ask, for example, is, how did greed affect your relationship? Okay. Which is used to safeguard either party from continued attack during the process of mediation. The technique of externalizing the conflict will prove to have tremendous advantage to our discussion of social change and the conflict resolution process. Social change, as mentioned earlier, is unfortunately a catalyst for increased conflict. As parties to the conflict vie for continued or newly attained social status, position, or power. During the process of social change, which is of critical importance, since social change occurs dynamically rather than statically, where any number of factors influence the effectiveness of change, it is of the utmost importance to facilitate the disclosure, as mentioned earlier, of each party, which serves as the means of externalizing the conflict. So let me give you an example. For example, assume that as part of social change, community activists identify disproportionate academic performance on standardized tests, wherein individuals from financially impoverished communities tend to perform lower than individuals from financially affluent communities. This is true. Imagine, furthermore, as is often the case, both communities reside within relatively the same geographic location. That is, both communities share the same zip code. One could imagine that conflict escalates and mediation teams are called in to aid in mitigating growing hostilities within the community. As parts of the process of mediating this conflict, mediators should actively identify those factors within the conflict that readily lend themselves to externalization. Like the process of externalizing problem at the interpersonal level, social mediation would require the appropriate form wherein members of the community could express their views, potentially to a panel of experts, which include professionally trained mediators, and externalize their frustration. One may imagine that the idea of quote-unquote fairness may surface during their forum discussion. The idea of fairness, then, could be effectively externalized to facilitate the mediation process. If, for the sake of argument, it is identified that the reason for the disparity in standardized test scores pertains to dramatic differences in funding, also assuming that both school districts are state schools and receive state subsidization, then the obvious conflict may be externalized in terms of fairness. Is it fair, one may ask, for there to be such huge differences in state subsidization, academic infrastructural resources, if it is assumed that there is a connection between these resources and educational outcomes on standardized tests? Granted, the example I pose is far too complex to analyze in any meaningful way here, but my objective is to demonstrate how the process of externalizing the conflict assists in mitigating the conflict. So, to be clear, the point of the example isn't to make some means of resolving that conflict, right? Jonathan Kozel writes a lot about this, and even he, in all of his brilliance, has difficulty conceptualizing, resolutions to the nature of this type of conflict without it being very, very contentious, because it's a redistribution of wealth and blah, 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 blah. That's not the point of this. If you think that's the point of this, you've missed the point. The point is showing you how you externalize at a macro level the concept, for example, of fairness. Individuals in the community are escalating the conflict, and the idea is to identify why the conflict in this particular example is being escalated, and people might start finger pointing and yelling and screaming in an actual social mediation. The idea is to suppress, to mitigate the potential, to de-escalate the potential conflict. Mediators in this forum should externalize the process of fairness and put that on the table for discussion. Rather than finger pointing at the rich people or finger pointing at the poor people or what have you, we can talk to the idea of fairness. Now granted, fairness itself might be charged. It as a concept itself might be contentious, but you get the idea, right? The idea is to externalize the social conditions that would otherwise escalate conflict and thereby suppress social transformation, and allow the forum with which both parties to the conflict can objectively talk about this now externalized tension without finger pointing. Okay. The antithesis, however, which also escalates conflict within social movements, is undeniably to personalize the conflict. To identify individual persons or individual organizations as the source of the problem is to intentfully place those individuals or organizations within harm's way. As a contemporary example, for example, to be rather blunt, as a contemporary example, the Trayvon Martin murder case personalized the perpetrator of the murder, George Zimmerman, as a source of the growing internal frustrations within marginalized communities. The perpetrator of the crime then becomes the representation of all systemic social injustices to which many marginalized people now oppose. Let me get rid of that. Right. It is to no surprise then that there are countless death threats against the perpetrator of this crime, specifically George Zimmerman, unfortunately. In truth, it was not the crime itself, but the representation of the crime as emblematic of the kinds of social injustices members of marginalized communities face. Social transformation requires a keen awareness to these and many other factors, as tensions will invariably mount, to always externalize the conflict in non-subjective oriented ways as a means of effective and peaceful social mobilization and change. Otherwise, personalizing the conflict through generalized representations of social injustice will almost certainly result in an escalated conflict, which will require greater uses of force to regain systemic order. So, quick recap. In any process of social transformation, there's bound to be growing hostilities between competing sort of paradigms. And those paradigms are represented by individual people, so people are going to get upset. If you recognize as a trained mediator within a social context, a macro level, that this could escalate in a riot, in violence, in murders, what you want to do is you want to de-escalate the potential conflict by externalizing the conflict and allowing people to discuss the conflict externally, right, in a non-subjective oriented way. So the example of the Trayvon Martin case is a perfect example of how you should not do it, right? George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin had a disagreement. That disagreement unfortunately led to the death of Trayvon Martin. The death of Trayvon Martin ended up becoming a symbol for the subjugation and repression and abuse of marginalized populations throughout the U.S., which isn't a good or a bad thing. It's not bad that that happened, that he ended up becoming symbolic. It's not good that he ended up becoming symbolic. It just ended up becoming symbolic. Then what we now have is a pinpoint, definitive location for social injustice. It's George Zimmerman. I don't believe this, obviously, but this is what happens sort of socially. Socially, members of the marginalized community now see and can identify and can personify the bad guy. You're the bad guy. You're the reason why we have been suffering for so long. And he gets death threats, right? Now, the idea is, as a mediator, as a peacekeeper, as someone who trains PhD level peacekeepers to mitigate conflicts from and to de-escalate conflicts from getting to the point where individuals are targeted for death or riots break out, you externalize that potential hostility. You externalize the symbolism of Trayvon Martin and allow the members of the community to discuss his symbolic nature, his death as symbolic. Or you, conversely, externalize George Zimmerman not as the individual, but as systemic injustices, systemic marginalization, in a manner that community members can understand. And it takes the pressure off of the individual, right? So, you know, the idea is we allow the court system to handle justice. Vigilante justice is not the way to go about, you know, solving your potential conflicts. Okay, so the next section is on negotiation. Effectively using negotiation strategies for social change, interest-based positions. Though much can be said of any myriad number of strategic approaches to negotiation, recognizing party interests is the most effective means of facilitating any negotiation. There are many types of negotiation, so I will attempt to offer the broadest approach to negotiation to facilitate an all-inclusive approach to the topic. Now, granted, this is not easy. It wasn't easy to write at all, and I know people watching this have expert-level negotiation training. The idea is to incorporate many different components of negotiation theory proper into one very, very sort of generalized account that could be implemented and practiced effectively. It wasn't easy to write at all. I fully recognize that some of my practical applications to negotiation will not apply to very context-specific negotiation. For example, bargaining-dependent negotiations where dependency is intangible, which profoundly complicates any negotiation process. Obviously, tangible bargaining-dependent interests are easier to satisfy than intangible bargaining-dependent interests, to be technical for a little bit. Thus, I assume tangible, that is, statistically verifiable and accessible demands. Nevertheless, in terms of practical and strategic approaches to negotiation, identifying respective party interests serves as the means of determining the ability to negotiate. This approach also assumes that negotiation is even possible. For example, negotiation wouldn't be possible with a terrorist group, so obviously that's excluded from this example. I will discuss two extremely effective methods for identifying party interests excluding the obvious attempt to simply ask parties for their interests or of their interests. First, one must recognize the fact that often parties to conflicts have neither identified nor is it absolute that they know what their interests are prior to the negotiation. As a practical rule, I assume that parties' interests are susceptible to change as a direct consequence of the negotiation process. Otherwise, there really is no need for negotiation. The often overused conflict resolution phrase, win-win, quote-unquote, is a definitional justification that interests are amended and conceded. Thus, rather than simply rehashing the canonical account of interest-based negotiation, I would encourage potential negotiators to facilitate parties in identifying their interests actively as opposed to merely cataloging a list of demands. The proactive approach to negotiation in no sense undermines existing negotiation tactics, it augments existing tactics. To facilitate the process, negotiators should help construct party interests in terms of appeal to their respective psychological egoism, that is, consensus results in a win-win only when concessions do not favor one party over another. The idea is this, right? A win-win negotiation model results in necessarily concessions being made. You're not going to be able to be adamant that and hold steadfast to your interest-based claim if you refuse to accommodate on any ground. That refusal negates the process of negotiation. So that the idea is you're better able as a negotiator to facilitate a win-win if parties to the conflict immediately know from the very beginning, this is sort of basic, I think, that concessions will facilitate win-win, right? We want both to win here, but recognize that insofar as you make concessions, it's not that you're giving up something and you might lose something, it's that you're accommodating the other person's interest-based and you in order for you both to arrive at what's known as a win-win situation, right? So it's completely driven, I argue, solely driven by the psychological egoism of each party. Appeal to their desire to win and tell them that concessions will not compromise you winning, right? Thus, though this would need substantial theoretical development, something I am here unwilling to undertake, though I do pose this challenge to readers, is the development of negotiation metrics, specifically negotiation metrics assessing the readiness to concede. For example, let us analyze the following question on a Likert scale, right? So you can make a Likert scale out of this particular question. Number one, your willingness to concede portions of your interest if doing so decreases the likelihood of their gains. What is your willingness to concede portions of your interests to give up what you really want if doing so decreases the likelihood that they'll gain, right? There's a trick to this, right? There's tons of research, and I've already done a video on, and I'll actually put a link to Prisoner's Dilemma here. Link to Prisoner's Dilemma. The idea is that individuals usually find themselves in attempting to get a win-win, they end up getting a win-lose because they don't recognize the power of concession, right? Concession is an extremely powerful tool. It's not that you concede everything, but you have, as you enter the process of negotiation as the party, things that you are willing to concede in order to arrive at a win, but individuals who aren't really willing to concede anything, or who are only willing to concede such that it facilitates some disadvantage to the opponent in a very sort of pessimistic model, usually end up shooting themselves in the foot. So number two, your willingness to concede portions of your interest if doing so increases the likelihood of their gains. Yeah, I mean, this one's usually obvious, right? Most people are unwilling, very unwilling, to concede if doing so is going to beneficially affect the likelihood of someone increasing their gains, right? So the critical important aspect of these questions is the assumption. That's what's important. which is not present in the question. Namely, the person reading this question will very likely, unless they themselves had attained rather advanced training, assume that the likelihood of the other party's gain comes at the expense of their loss, which is clearly not a component part of the question. I've designed this question not to test the willingness of the party to negotiate, to demonstrate that in the process of negotiating, each party assumes that concessions equal a loss rather than a win. That's absolutely important, right? It's undeniable, the research is there, that parties typically enter the negotiation process with the assumption that concessions result in a loss, when in fact concession is, if not the greatest means of attaining a win, it's one of the greatest means of attaining a win-win is by conceding a few points, right? Rather than a loss. All right. Thus, interests are frequently misunderstood. Secondly, then, my previous point is legitimized and justified by the finding in the now famous example of the prisoner's dilemma. The precise nature of the dilemma is constituted in party assumptions regarding the benefit of negotiation. A skilled negotiator should encourage each party to the conflict to recognize that their interests, that is, those aspects of their demands which they defend, are themselves subject to undermining what they think the end result is likely to be. It's rather technical. Basically, all that means is it's important to recognize, as a negotiator, that you inform the parties that an adamant refusal to concede your interests typically results in a loss for that party, whereas the ability to sort of cognitively shift the way that the party thinks in such that you facilitate a willingness to concede some aspects of their interest-based model, their interest-based negotiation, usually facilitates in a win-win. So the idea becomes, do you want to lose everything, or to keep it simple, do you want to lose everything by being adamant and refusing to concede anything, or do you want to win something or most things by conceding a few points, right? And that's where the negotiation process is the most taxing for the negotiator, is to facilitate this sort of back and forth. Practically, the simple question posed from the negotiator to the party, are you assuming that, quote unquote, places the respective parties in a position to express those factors that inform their interests. Thus, the practical use of interest-based negotiation potentially gains further effectiveness if negotiators actively challenge parties to identify the assumptions, if any, that inform their interest positions. Okay, so rather technical bit. I want to read, let me see how much more I have left, quite a bit more. So I'm going to read one more section, and then I'll pause at this point because it still has to do with negotiation models. So what's important to recognize in the last section is that skilled negotiators at the international level need to ensure that as parties enter the process of negotiation, they recognize that their interests are served by the act of concession, right? The idea that concessions will not be made usually undermine their interests. So, bottom of page 10, effectively using negotiation strategies for social change, bargaining dependencies. In further analyzing practical strategies for effective negotiation, one should consider the role of bargaining dependencies in and throughout the negotiation process. These dependencies, bargaining dependency is a technical term, these dependencies act as currency, if you will, within the process. That is, value has been attributed to these dependencies by each party, and the value of each dependency is translated into both demands and interests, which determine the stance or position each party is likely to take. It's sort of advanced, right? The stronger the connection each party has to these dependencies, the less likely they are to concede those interests. Obviously then, these dependencies then, and party attachment to these dependencies, compromise the win-win goal by facilitating reluctance to relinquish or concede those interest-based positions. The weaker the connection each party has to these dependencies, the more likely they are to concede those interests. For example, suppose both parties to the negotiation are contesting the roles respective members of the community should play in ensuring that clean drinking water is readily available to residents within the community. It's pretty obvious. External contractors have hired community members for intensive manual labor and have also provided laborers with bottled clean drinking water. Okay. Community residents realize that they do not possess the financial means of creating a community drinking well. Community residents realizing that they do not possess the financial means of creating a community drinking well select the construction of the well as one of their bargaining dependencies. That is, the dependency in this example rests outside or beyond community control. So, to be clear, external contractors have hired community members for intensive manual labor and also provide the laborers with bottled water. The community members are like, hey, listen, we don't have a problem being laborers. You can imagine that this is in the developing world somewhere. We don't have a problem being contracted laborers, but as part of our labor agreement, we want you to dig a well for us. You dig the well for us. Obviously, this would reduce maybe wages in some regard, to be fair. So you dig the well for us and we'll work for you, right? We appreciate the bottled water, but we want a means of sustaining clean drinking water after this job, after this contract is over. The well is a dependency because its construction is dependent on what they can in turn offer contractors in return for satisfying this dependency. Thus, traditional dependencies within a negotiation model obligate parties to the conflict to satisfy some set of conditions which would increase the likelihood of mutual benefit. Remember, this is all about, at least my interpretation of this is all about egoism. It's about, I'm willing to help you if helping you helps me. I am not willing to help you if helping you does not help me. Right? That's the assumption here. And I recognize that that assumption might have some contention, but that's the assumption that I'm making. Thus, traditional dependencies within a negotiation model obligate parties to the conflict to satisfy some set of conditions which would increase the likelihood of mutual benefit. It is important, however, to recognize the dynamic nature of dependencies within the negotiation model. Granted, my analysis is certainly non-traditional, but the dependencies also remain well within the control of those whose primary demand obligate the other party to the conflict. Returning to the example then, the contractors wish to establish a business relation within this community which community members support. But as a consequence of doing business, the community establishes a list of demands. Though the well is certainly a dependency within a traditional negotiation model, to be technical, assuming that a refusal to build the well will result in a lose-lose situation. You refuse to build the well, we're not going to offer ourselves or allow ourselves to be contracted for labor. Thus, contracting us, community members, for labor is contingent on the dependency of you building the well. This is sort of very technical, but it should be simple to see now, right? That is, the success of the negotiation, not a party, is itself dependent on the willingness of each party, each party has to make concessions. Thus, I would argue that that willingness, that is the willingness to make concessions by each party to the negotiation, is ultimately the most influential dependency within any negotiation, right? It's very technical stuff, right? The idea is this. There are dependencies within any negotiation model, and those dependencies are themselves dynamically related to very, very, very obviously bargaining interests, right? bargaining dependent, bargaining independent interests. For those interests which are bargaining dependent, right? For those interests where the dependency itself, the well, is a condition of this win-win need, there is a sense in which if the community just goes to the contractors and say, hey, listen, if you don't build a well, we're not going to work, well, that's going to ultimately lead to a lose-lose, right? Because it forces the other party to the negotiation to have to satisfy those demands. And if you put the party in a position where, prior to even negotiation, demands are set on the table, and if these demands aren't met, then we're not going to play ball. If everything isn't open to negotiation, then why participate in the act of negotiation itself? The fact is that there's probably, in a realistic setting, going to be other laborers who are willing to do the labor, and what will happen is that the contractor is going to relocate business somewhere else, find accommodating laborers, and not have to build a well. So that the idea is, a problem in this model, I would argue, to be technical now, is the fact that the community, remember, we're talking about social change, the community approached the process of negotiation with only one dependency and only one contingency. And that contingency will work if you dig the well. That's problematic because you don't bring anything else to the table to negotiate. And if there is a refusal, and there likely will be a refusal from the party, well, you undermine any wages that you would have otherwise earned, and you undermine the sustainability of a well that you could have otherwise had you had other interest-based dependencies on the table to negotiate. Then the potential contractor could have selected from options, but by giving only one option, you compromise. It's not that it's a no-go, but you compromise. You put too many, quote-unquote, you put all your eggs in a basket, to be sort of ghetto for a second. You put all your eggs in a basket, and that's not the best negotiation tactic at all. You want to make sure that you have a diversified set of options. And in that diversified set of options, your interests are equally dispersed. You yourself know where your interests are most heavy, and you put out, quote-unquote, pawns in a sense. You put out interests that you have but are willing to concede, and as concessions take place, you can then demonstrate to the other party how much you are willing to relinquish, and you might end up getting the well. But if you just go in there with the well, it's going to look more like a mandate and less like a negotiation, and you, meaning the negotiator and the party, and both parties, you're either going to arrive at an impasse, or you're going to arrive at a situation where both parties lose, and it was a waste of time when it could have been reconciled. So there is no possibility for negotiation without at least, at the very least, the possibility for concessions to be made, since concessions influence the negotiation process. Negotiations are themselves dependent on at least the possibility for concession. Thus, I would argue bargaining dependencies rest both internally and externally for each party to the conflict. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this paper into two parts. This is going to conclude the first part because I have quite a bit more to read, and I'm probably already 45 minutes, maybe an hour into the video. So this is going to conclude part one. I will have the notes or my writing available in part one, but I won't upload part two until another day. So with that, I'm going to pause here. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.